I am ready whenever both of you are ready. Thank you for bearing with me.
I am ready. Thank
I'm
you.
ready as well.
All right, Falko, here we go. Welcome to this episode of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. I'm your host, Olga Peters, and today we have a great show with regular contributor Emily Kornheiser, who is one of 3 representatives to the town of Brattleboro. Hey, Emily.
Hi, Olga.
And we also have with us Falko Schilling, who is the advocacy director with the ACLU Vermont. And for those who don't know what ACLU stands for, it is the American Civil Liberties Union. And Falko, thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on. And as a native of Windham County, it's good to be talking to folks from down there. I grew up down in Saxons River. Yeah, fun fact. But speaking to you live from Main Street, Montpelier today.
So nice to have a neighbor in the house.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for joining us. Falko, I want to start with a theme that Emily and I have been basically circling around since COVID-19 started in March, which is, you know, with this pandemic, it highlighted so many cracks in our system. And even though it feels new, it's not new. So many of the issues we're facing now are just bigger because of COVID, but they're not new. And so with the ACLU Vermont's work in the state, I'm curious from your perspective, what issues have you been dealing with that might feel bigger now, but actually aren't new?
So one of the major issues that we've had to deal with since the outbreak of COVID, and one of the things we've been focusing on is no different from what we were focusing on before the outbreak, which is our mass incarceration within the state and our Department of Corrections. And as anyone who's been following the news knows, that presents a huge problem when you're having people held in close quarters without the ability to quarantine, without the ability to social distance. And so at the very beginning of this pandemic, that was a clear need, was to address that system. It's something we've been talking about for years and years and years, is that we are incarcerating too many people. At this point, we're incarcerating people out of state in Mississippi because we don't have enough capacity in state. And that, I think for us, that was one of the first things we were really focused on. And as a result of the changes that were necessitated by COVID, we've actually seen policy in that area accelerate and seen some pretty impressive changes. You know, the ACLU of Vermont is part of the nationwide Smart Justice campaign, which is calling for a 50% reduction in our prison population to directly combat the racial disparities that exist within our criminal legal system. And for what that means here in Vermont is at our peak in 2008, we incarcerated 2,200 people. And so our goal is to reduce that down to 1,100 people, so 50% of where we were at the peak. If you look at the numbers right now, Vermont is only incarcerating around 1,350 people, meaning we've made a 38% reduction in our prison population since the beginning of, since the height of 2008. But almost, I think, close to 300 people were let out or not held in prison since the start of the pandemic. And that's without any new laws. That's using discretion. Yeah, sorry.
I found that so fascinating and wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. I shouldn't, just use the word fascinating. Wonderful. Because my understanding was that before the pandemic, a lot of the story or a lot of the explanation for why we had so many people incarcerated was that there was nowhere for them to go if they were released, as if this was an unsolvable problem. And so we had to solve the entire housing system before we could possibly, which means solving the whole zoning system and the whole revenue problem, before we could possibly even begin to think about the correction system. But
Yeah.
what we've seen is that, like, when there is a will, rapid change is possible, and those folks are housed.
Yeah, and I think, and to the point of the cracks that the pandemic exposed, while it showed us this incredible opportunity to think about how our correction system worked, I do think there are many cracks that we're seeing in terms of the systems that exist to support people when they re-enter their communities. So housing is still a concern. We heard from folks, though it's great that they were, able to be released and they were being put out there with nothing more than their shower shoes. And that's a huge concern as well. We can't just, it's not just saying let's have less people incarcerated, it's making sure that people have the supports they need. Housing is huge. And that is, in terms of the work that's been happening around the Department of Corrections, that is a major focus, looking at models that work, that are supportive. Because right now, I think there's something like 150 people inside the Department of Corrections now because we can't find housing. But as you're saying, that's not the whole story. A lot of the story was people either being returned from community supervision for things that are technical violations, things that are not new crimes. Vermont returns people. Yeah, sorry about
technical violations thing, because I don't, I think a lot of Vermonters understand that people are released and then returned to prison, but I don't think the nature of how that happens is really as clear to people as it could be.
That's a good
Yep.
point, Emily. Thank you.
Thank you for bringing me back. So when someone is, say, for instance, released from the incarcerative setting into the community, usually at this point in time, almost everyone is put on a system that is called furlough in Vermont. And it's not the furlough you would think about, from like the Willie Horton ads, or, where someone gets 2 days off to go to a funeral or something like that. This is a status that says, we're going to allow you to live in the community. We technically still count you as someone who's incarcerated. The prison walls have been expanded into the community, and people get conditions that they're released under. So it might mean that you have to be drug and alcohol free. It might mean you can't associate with certain people. It might mean you have to have housing. There's a number of different conditions that are imposed based on, someone's individual history and their needs. And what a technical violation is, it's when someone breaks one of those conditions of release. So it could be something like, someone went out and had a beer, came back to a sober housing unit, and that's not unacceptable. That is something that can get people returned to an incarcerative setting, sent back to prison for doing something that wouldn't be a crime if someone who is not under the supervision of the Department of Corrections, it's not a crime to have a beer, or it's not a crime at this point to have a small amount of cannabis. But if you're under the supervision of the Department of Corrections, those are the type of things that could get someone pulled back into an incarcerative setting because it violated the conditions that they are being supervised in the community.
And it's also not a crime to associate with someone who has committed a crime,
right?
Which is a major reason for technical violations. So I don't want to take us too far off, but I think this is a really interesting topic about what it means when we extend the carceral I or the carceral state. I don't want to get too postmodern geeky here, but into families and communities to that degree, and what that does to communities, what that does to people's lives, and what that does to the role of government. And I think that happens with our child protection system almost as much as it happens with the furlough correction, part of correction.
And then so many times those systems become intertwined. People who are involved with the correction system are usually involved with many other different systems within state government. And that's part of the problem, is those systems aren't always being there to be supportive. They aren't integrated. And then you do have that extension of the prison walls in a way that it can be extremely disruptive. It's often not the right thing to help someone actually rehabilitate and become a member of their community again, when any false step can send you back to prison, which then can mean you lose your housing, you lose your job, can lose your kids. So many different things result from, what I've heard them referred to as small dips, but sending anyone to prison for any amount of time can be so disruptive. And so I think that's part of the reason as a state, we are looking at how we change the community supervision system. That's been one of the big focuses of the work over the last year. And even after the pandemic, I was really heartened that this was a big topic in March before the pandemic up in Montpelier, and then after the pandemic, it remained a really central topic of discussion, and with the limited bandwidth of the legislature, something that people put a lot of really significant work in to try and make improvements to that system.
I'm, going back to the furlough system, I think what has always caught my attention is, there's this concept, whether it's a good concept or a bad concept, but there's this concept that I think a lot of people operate on, that if you go to prison, you're supposed to, do your time. And then when you've done your time, you're rehabilitated and you go back to the community, and it's supposed to be like a clean slate. And yet it is just not treated that way at all. And so often we send people back to the community and say, well, you've changed and you have to change, because if you don't, we're going to here are the ramifications. And yet we send them back to the same environment and situation and conditions that created the problem to begin with. And then say, well, but why aren't you changed?
Well, and there's also the other side of that where, people are going back to their families and communities, which might be where a behavior or a crime happened in the first place.
That's what I
It
mean,
doesn't
yeah.
mean it's not the best possible place for them to be in to return to their,
True.
return to life. And often that return to home is then criminalized because of whoever else might be in that home or whatever other behaviors might happen in that home, regardless of the actual behavior of the person who is reintegrating.
Yeah,
Thank
and
you.
going back,
Yes.
going back to just the point that you made earlier in terms of exposing some of these cracks, we also know that the systems of support for folks who are reentering their communities, they're not the same across the entire state. There are some pretty glaring geographic disparities in what's available from one place to another. So sometimes your ability to successfully reintegrate into the community can often be dependent on what resources are available to you in your specific community. If you can't get transportation to be able to make it to all your scheduled appointments, then that's something that can end up leading you to, to end up being reincarcerated. And one thing, someone that I worked with for years was formerly incarcerated. And she used to tell me she'd do an exercise where she'd sit down with folks who are, highly professional and say, okay, here's all the things that I needed to do when I came out of prison. I needed to be at this appointment at this time, this appointment at this time. I need to find a job that's going to let me take off 2 hours in the middle of the day to go and see all these different people. I need to see my therapist. I need to see my job counselor, and I'd see my probation officer. And sometimes the restrictions and the structures that we put on top of people as they're trying to, come back from one of the lowest moments in their lives and rebuild that life, the amount of barriers we put in front of those people sometimes can just prove insurmountable. And that's another thing we need to make sure we're thinking about, is providing those resources to actually make it possible. So things like housing and transportation, offering two of the most important things from the get-go. And this is why, in many ways, when we look at trying to reform our system and corrections, we need to do so much more upstream in the first place, in terms of building a society that actually meets people's needs and supports people. So, because often what we see is when people end up in a corrections system, I often see that as a failure of our system as a whole. There's usually things that are missing in the first place, supports that should have been there. And also when you look at the amount of people who are in our correction system who've experienced trauma in their lives, serious and significant trauma, we don't have enough supports and systems in place to help people deal with that, especially folks who are experiencing that trauma at a really young age. So that's another thing we need to be thinking about, is, all the way down to how do we support, the youth of this state and support young families.
So if I remember correctly, the ACLU Vermont has been working on what it is broadly calling smart justice. So what are some of the components of that smart justice initiative that, one, you're working on, two, that maybe have come to fruition?
Yeah, so the Smart Justice campaign has a lot of components. And as I was saying earlier, over this last year, we've been focusing quite a bit on the community supervision portion of how our system works, because after data-driven analysis, we found out that Vermont reincarcerates people on community supervision at the highest rate of any state in the country. So that was a glaring place to start, to say, okay, we know this is something we can try and address. One thing we're going to be trying to talk quite a bit about in the legislature this year is about data, is how we can make more data-driven decisions, because within our system, within our whole criminal legal system, there's so many glaring blind spots where we can see maybe what happened before and what happens after, but you have that black box where it's hard to tell what's driving this. Like, we know that Black people in Vermont are incarcerated about 9 times, at a rate about 9 times that of white Vermonters, but we don't see all the points along the system that helps create that. It makes it's hard to figure out exactly what policy levers to pull to try and help address those things. We have some data on
without data, we just assume that it's implicit bias at the point of arrest or implicit bias in the court. But there's really interesting parts of that when more data becomes revealed around our policies around parole and our policies around release, and what is considered home and what we do with out-of-state people versus in-state, like how we even perceive out-of-state versus in-state. It's fascinating. And the data shortages in Vermont are
Vast.
So, yeah, vast. And so, I mean, this is, after working on a number of different issues up in the State House for over a decade, this isn't the first time that I've had to come forward and say, well, our data is really lacking. And that's what we need more data, which often feels like a kind of an insufficient answer to a question about how do we address this. But I think this last year showed us a great example of how having that data can really drive smart policy, because that was information people didn't have. DOC was not collecting that data. They were not analyzing that data. It took an outside entity coming into the state with resources and the ability to clean up hand data and work with the Department of Corrections to actually figure that out. And we said, oh, well, this is a clear problem that we can try and address. So data is a huge portion of it. Looking at how our community supervision system, how we can stop returning people at such high rates. We also want to look at sentencing. Sentencing is a huge, huge factor in how long people are incarcerated. When you look at the rise of mass incarceration around the country, so much of that was driven by increased sentencing laws and tough on crime legislation coming from in the 80s and into the 90s. And one of the things that's really hard is that sets a floor that as a legislature, it's hard to go back and say, we're actually going to reduce penalties. I don't think there's a lot of people going around saying I'm tough on crime, but it's still a hard thing to do. Like in seeing some of that debate in the legislature, it's fascinating, but it's an essential component of the work.
It is. And to unpack, I think unpacking popular stories in the legislature is one of the most difficult things to do. And, I've only been trying to do it for 2 years. And I imagine that the longer I stay, the more those stories will become my stories, and it will become even harder to unpack them because then they're mine and not someone else's. But understanding evidence-based decision-making around recidivism and the ages that people tend to reoffend, how long an effective if you have an assumption that the point of sentencing is sort of prevention of future crimes, there's so much evidence that pretty much after 2 years, there's no point in keeping someone incarcerated anymore, unless you're talking about the 1 in the million, Silence of the Lambs kind of situation. But beyond that, it's tiny sentences are all that's needed for effective punishment, if you believe in punishment at all.
Yeah, and one of the big things is that the punishments are swift and they're known, and you're not seeing huge variations in it. That's one of the biggest factors in terms of whether or not any sort of punishment can be rehabilitative. But you're exactly right. The length of sentence times is not usually tied to any sort of social science data. It's tied to, I think, largely this desire to punish people, and what is the necessary punitive sentence we can impose. When if we're looking at things through the lens of public safety, that's not always necessary, and also can be detrimental. Sometimes the longer you keep someone incarcerated, the more likely they are going to be to develop a higher criminogenic risk. And so looking at things that we can try and reduce those sentences to the point where social science says it makes sense, while still balancing the needs of victims to feel that their voices are heard, that their interests are being taken into account, are all really important. But we've gotten so far out of whack and so skewed beyond where we used to be years ago. And that's one of the biggest drivers. So that was one disappointment I had in this last legislative session. There was a really strong piece of legislation around felony sentences for property crimes that made its way through the House and then made its way to the Senate, but just didn't make it all the way through because of the limited time to COVID. But Vermont has one of the lowest felony thresholds in all of New England, where if you commit a property crime, that the value is $900 or more, that's considered a felony, which can be hugely detrimental.
I'd love to unpack that a little bit for our Windham County folks to really understand the impact in our county and our community specifically. So if you look at crimes that are often committed because someone is seeking opioids that they are not able to obtain, they don't have the money to obtain them otherwise, it's often property crimes that you would find. And so if someone is doing that and they receive a felony conviction because of that, the impact on the larger system in terms of the cost to all of us, their opportunities to seek treatment is so far exacerbated when, if it wasn't a felony, sort of the path to treatment and the path to community is much shorter and easier. And if you talk to our prosecutor down here, she will say that if, you know, property crimes were pretty much sort of taken off the table, she would have very, very little to do. And she's happy to have that happen.
So a question for both Emily and Falko here. You know, we have this story in Vermont that we are so progressive and open-hearted and community-minded, which is definitely true in one sense. But as you're describing some of the issues with our criminal system, it seems like it's a little Salem witch trials, burn the witch, punitive, puritanical here. Any thoughts on why that is? Like, why is Vermont operating that way when maybe other states in New England are not?
You want to take this first or should I?
I'm happy to, I can start. You know, we have a deep Puritan thing happening here always, and that's definitely true. I also think it's one of the, it's another one of those places in our system where our low resource capacity and our small administrative structures also makes a difference. So we have very few judges. We have a very small judicial system. And so in some ways that should make it more nimble, but it also means that fewer people are making decisions. Those decisions have less eyes on them. We don't do jury trials. You know, things are, you know, our public defenders are incredibly under-resourced. Our prosecutors are incredibly under-resourced. Everyone is just trying to get everything like through the door, out the door as fast as they possibly can. And the time for sort of the evidence-based decision-making and the community input is not there. And so I think often it's more that than necessarily the puritanical stuff, which is like definitely in the background, but not the foreground of why we fail.
Yeah, and I think one thing that from my perspective is when, you know, we're part of the United States of America. I think that's a really important piece of context to understand is the United States of America jails more people per capita than I think almost anywhere else in the entire world. Like we jail significant portions of our population. And while Vermont inside of the US context has one of the lowest rates of incarceration per capita, we're still part of that larger system. I guess in some ways it's an implicit bias that we have towards over incarceration. And you also look at what's happening in states around us. This is what the normal is. This is what the expectation is. And it's those stories that we've been told for years and years. And so much of this is, you know, building up this idea that there's a necessity to be tough on crime. And I think it also goes back to some of the roots that exist within our criminal legal system in terms of control of communities of color. I think that is also a motivator that exists within a lot of incarceral settings and then has been systematically adopted across the country. You have some of that slippage where you see what one state is doing, other states say, well, if that makes sense for them, we'll do that as well. And I think that's how you saw a lot of that creep in terms of how many people we're incarcerating, how we think about our systems. We think about incarceration completely differently than, you know, say some of the Scandinavian countries that think about incarceration. They are not looking to build, you know, mega prison complexes that house people for extended amounts of times. They are more focused on rehabilitation. So I think there's a lot to unpack there, but I think part of it is like we are part of the United States of America, which has built a system of mass incarceration. And I think Vermont's doing a good job of trying to reckon with that and understand what that means for us. But in some ways, you know, the starting block for us is changed because of the air we're breathing and how the systems around us all work. Because, you know, in many ways, Vermont does better at corrections policies than many other places in the country, but that's still not very good when you look around the rest of the world and how other people would create similar systems.
Thank you. We need to go to break to hear from some of our underwriters here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. Stay tuned. Emily Kornheiser and Falko Schilling and I will return in a moment. Welcome back to the second half of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. I'm your host, Olga Peters, and if you're just joining me, I'm speaking with Representative Emily Kornheiser from Brattleboro, as well as Falko Schilling, who is the Advocacy Director of ACLU Vermont. And Emily, do we need to remind our listeners of something?
We do. The views and opinions expressed here on the Montpelier Happy Hour are those of the guest, the host, whoever else is in the Zoom room, but not of the radio station or the TV station or Facebook or Mark Zuckerberg or anyone else involved in any of this. It's just ours, the people who are speaking.
And we are owning that. And on that note, I think it's good for us to shift with Falko. One thing I find interesting about the conversation we were just having around incarceration, there's so many places, I think, in especially in society, but in Vermont, where different needs overlap. And I have sat and covered events where victims of crime are talking, and they feel that Vermont's system is too lenient and doesn't meet their needs enough. And it brings me to questions of, say, what do we do when so many of these rights or these needs interact? And I think hate speech, hate crime, the First Amendment, white supremacy, these are all other places where pieces of our community might actually be at odds with each other. Is there anything around that the ACLU is working on right now? And how do you kind of balance those two pieces of the same coin?
So that's a really interesting question. And I think it's a place where a lot of conversations are coming right now in this state in a lot of different spaces. I know Representative Kornheiser and I both participate in the Social Equity Caucus, which is a group of legislators, community leaders who come together to talk about pressing issues regarding social equity. And this has been one of the hottest topics in terms of this conversation, because we wish that some of the white supremacy and the other problems we're hearing about around the country were isolated to places around the country, but they're not. The problems exist. Racism exists here in Vermont. White supremacy exists here in Vermont. And we need to be able to deal with those problems. What becomes somewhat difficult in terms of how we address them is thinking about, is this a place that legislation is the correct answer? And so the ACLU of Vermont, one of our core values is we defend and protect the Constitution of the United States. And the First Amendment is an area where it can be really difficult for folks who have really, really good intentions, who want to try and protect people who feel like they're being victimized. In terms of whether or not there's actual legislation that can move forward that would do that without infringing on people's First Amendment rights. So the ACLU is a strong defender of the First Amendment. For folks that know our organization, this has often led us to taking some controversial positions, such as advocating for neo-Nazis to march in the streets of Skokie, Illinois, which was at the time the town with the largest percentage of Holocaust survivors, which is not something that I would personally support. But it's something that we intervene to support their First Amendment right to do that. And it's something that it's a hard tension to try and deal with. So when we look at First Amendment issues, we look at issues related to hate speech and hate crimes. That's one of the things we have to be very careful about, is how is the government regulating the speech of others, and to what extent? Because that is a place where you have to, there's very few things the state can do in terms of regulating speech that are acceptable and would be constitutional. And so part of our job as advocates is to try and let legislators know when they might be running afoul of the Constitution, because no one wants to pass a law that they then have to go defend in court and have it struck down. That's something that no one
like doing that sometimes, like the GMO labeling law. Like I think people are. I think actually Vermonters are a little bit more into that than.
Having worked on that law for multiple years, it was not struck down in court. But that's a story for another day.
Actually, that would be an interesting story for another day. I'm going to make note of that.
Yeah, wearing a previous hat.
Yeah, and I more mean that was the concern in the state house before it passed. It was one of those places where we were running afoul of commerce, etc. So
Yeah, very much so. And also a First Amendment issue, strangely enough. That was
Yeah.
First Amendment compelled commercial speech.
as is some of the cannabis signage and advertising.
Yep.
So I'm really had a very interesting experience a few months ago. And so I've, being Jewish in Vermont, being the person I am in Vermont, I am not surprised when people tell me about white supremacy behavior here. I know that's new for some people who have been able to live their lives in white peace. But it's certainly hasn't been a surprise to me. But what was a really interesting, disturbing experience that I had recently was I got a briefing from a division of the Department of Homeland Security that just collects information. And before that started, I, have certainly within the Trump era heard about how, Black Lives Matter and whatever Antifa is were being targeted. My past political history long before legislative office definitely tended more towards Black Bloc than towards, standard liberal Democrat lines. And so I was really concerned before this briefing started that I was going to be hearing about, how Black Lives Matter was bringing down the universe. And was pleasantly surprised that the focus of the briefing was really on white supremacist behavior in Vermont. And that domestic terrorism for this division of Homeland Security was absolutely about white supremacy and not about, sort of different sects within that, and not about Antifa or Black Lives Matter or whatever sort of rhetoric the Trump administration's been pushing. But it was still really interesting and disturbing to hear the particular line that they walk down about what their appropriate role is and what their appropriate role isn't as a division. And so they were talking a lot about how they are aware of activity, but they can't do anything about activity. And so they can have that awareness and they can share that awareness, but they can't act on that awareness. And so on some level, I'm just uncomfortable that my life is being tracked. And, in the Commerce Committee, we certainly began some really interesting conversations about privacy and digital privacy and all of that. But also really interested in the fact that in Vermont, we have this awareness of really intensive white supremacist organizing and behavior that we have no mechanism legally to do anything about. And so people are really upset with the Scott administration, and particularly with the Department of Public Safety, for saying this isn't our role because no crimes have been officially committed. And I think it's probably true that if different people were doing it in a different context, probably someone would find a way to intervene, perhaps illegally. And there's definitely a lot of culture at play there. But what I'm interested, and I know that there's pressure for us to change the laws so that someone could act, so that the police could act on some of that white supremacist organizing. But what I'm really interested in is what would be a legal administrative apparatus to prevent that behavior. So, we know that there's some really good countering violent extremism work that happens overseas, say in French-speaking Africa. We know that there's been some really progressive, fascinating anti-gang work that's happened in other states. That doesn't come out of police departments. It comes out of development agencies or social service agencies. That's much more human, much more proactive, and not about surveillance and targeting. And so I'm trying to get my head around sort of what that side of the conversation is, rather than trying to get government eyes into every citizen's home to police their individual behavior.
So I think you are leading to the right answer, just with how you set up your question, because when we think about these issues, our concern is whether the government, especially in the area of speech, is curtailing the speech of a private citizen, which is different, which is significantly different from encouraging programs for positive social change. So that's a place that we are fully, fully supportive of programs like that, especially if they're run outside of law enforcement agencies that can create positive community change. That's something that is something the state can 100% do. But there are limitations in terms of some of the restrictions on speech and other things, and it's really limited to the immediate incitement of violence. That is kind of that threshold when we're talking about this, which for a lot of people, rightfully so, is not comforting. That immediate threat of violence, people are saying there should be something that we should be able to do before that. So I think any piece of legislation we would always have to look at, and it have to be very fact specific in terms of where we come down. Is this something that we can support or not support? But we are fully supportive of efforts to try and curb domestic terrorism and white supremacy within the state, because we think it's essential to build the state where everyone who calls this Vermont home feels comfortable and feels like they are a part of this state. And there's no more of that othering that I think is something that happens within the state of Vermont when you are not part of the traditional majority. And I think we are seeing a lot of backlash from that, because there's a lot of people speaking up and saying, Vermont does not just look one way. We can't just look one way. And we need to be moving on beyond this traditional idea of, that some people have. And so there are some real serious threats. And I will say, as we led up to the election work, this was part of our struggle. We were trying to think of how do we respond? We were, ACLU Vermont and ACLU National, we had a scenario playbook of, I think there's 14 different scenarios that we need, major possible scenarios we need to be watching out for. But one of our big concerns is being an open carry state. Would there be open intimidation of voters at the polls, knowing that there was people planning to protest or possibly protest in the wake of an attempt to steal the election? What would people have to be? How aware would people be? And would there be a threat to people gathering from people who are armed and hoping to incite violence? So luckily we didn't see that within this election context this year, which we're really thankful for. But it was really an eye-opener about the need to be thinking about those things. Those are things we wish we weren't having to think about and to consider, but it's reality. It's the world that we live in these days. So I think,
I spoke to our town clerk quite a bit about the dynamic between making sure that everyone feels safe voting and what helps someone feel safe. So for one person, that might be actually bringing their gun with them. For another person, it might be having a police officer there. And for other people, having the police there would make them feel much less safe while voting. And so it becomes when we all have such different senses of who is on our side and where our freedom is maximized, I think it makes it really hard to navigate these really difficult conversations as communities when we have so few places where we can speak across that difference.
Yeah, and there's so many considerations, and I have to say that I think the Secretary of State and the AG's office did a good job trying to help support town clerks, because the work that they were doing in this last election was just incredible, to the point where we are going through things like, all right, what if someone refuses to wear a mask when they're voting? Well, we have a mask mandate. That's another place where you have that intersection of what is my personal freedom, my right to vote, versus a state-imposed mandate. How do those two interact? And I think they struck the right balance. They said, here's a ballot, go fill it out outside, bring it right back in. Your vote will count. If people refuse to, they kind of put them off in the corner. But that was I think this election in particular, and the run up to it, we were seeing so many of those freedoms bumping up against each other. And I think folks did a really good job trying to find that right balance. But the conversation is never going to stop. I think that's part of it. We are right now working with a racial equity task force that's been convened with the governor, who's looking specifically at these issues. What can the state do? What proposals can we put forward? So I'd say look forward for some of those recommendations. They should be coming out soon. They had one round of recommendations. Some of these will deal more directly with hate speech and hate crimes, but it's good to have that open dialogue. And I think it's interesting. There was a conversation that happened in the Social Equity Caucus with the state's attorneys coming in talking about how they charge hate crimes. And one of there was some comment saying, well, let's hope to get the Defender General's office and the ACLU in the chair on this so we can put them in the hot seat, because they're saying we should be decriminalizing and we should be, not locking people up for all these crimes. We'll see what they say now. I'm like, our position's pretty consistent. Like, we are not for criminalizing this behavior, though we think there are ways to encourage it, encourage more positive behavior. I think it's one of these things where there's always that tension, and sometimes you feel like you're on an interesting side of the issue, but that's part of why I do enjoy working for the ACLU, because you have to have that larger view. And in particular, I think one thing that's a point that we always talk about when it comes to hate speech and hate crimes, the over criminalization of that behavior, while the intent might be good, can often be misused and directed at marginalized communities, because as we see within our criminal justice system, or our criminal legal system, as many people like to refer to it, because it's not always that just. What we see is that when those laws are on the books, they're often targeted at marginalized groups and communities of colors as a way to reinforce the existing social order.
No, it's one of, it's one of the many places where if you're only keeping your eye on the short term, you're going to lose the long-term gains that are needed on this. And that's, true across most of our system, but particularly when it comes to our rights.
Mm-hmm. I for what's standing out to me right now, and both of you touched on this, is that tension between solutions and where those solutions can actually be found. And I think often we're like, well, let's just make a law about this, when perhaps the law is not the best way to go. And there are some social solutions that might be better, or vice versa. We're trying to do a social solution, and what we need is legislation. The other thing that is standing out to me right now is, and I think I've said this before, it fascinates me in this country how we are so adamant about our rights. And we say, well, I have the right to do this, I have the right to do that. And yet we so rarely have conversations about responsibility, that living in a free society actually carries a lot of responsibility. And we so rarely have those conversations. Just because you have the right to say something, that may not be the best use of your right.
Well, and, I think the masks and Thanksgiving behaviors are, an interesting example of that. I've been really struggling with many of our administration's responses to the pandemic lately, which were basically shutting down what can happen in public spaces, and maintaining, and I mean public and commercial and non-commercial. So basically shutting down things that can happen in non-commercial spaces while still allowing things that happen in commercial spaces, with the assumption that commercial spaces are somehow better regulated. And the implications for that long-term are very disturbing to me. And the latest example that I caught, and I did not listen to the press conference, I just read Jane Lindholm's tweet threads from them. So maybe this is not the most perfect sourcing of information, but she is a journalist. And so,
a good one.
And a good one. And it, she puts them in quotes when they're quotes, but this idea that children in schools are going to be asked what their families did over Thanksgiving, and that there might be implications for those families from that, and that the home is going to be policed in the public sphere by an institution, has such huge disturbing implications for me. And I know that we are in a pandemic and we want to survive, and I am not going to go around unmasked. I'm not saying we should all go around unmasked, but when you open a door, closing that door is very difficult. And the implications around, Salem witch trials and Soviet Stasi, it's very, I'm going to stop talking because I'm a little irate.
Or Minority Report. It was a great movie, but not a world I want to live in.
I want to know what Falko thinks about that.
I mean, I think there's a lot of places where those things interact. And I'd say when the original masking mandate came out, that was something that was a big discussion in the ACLU, not just here in Vermont, but around the country, is like, what does that mean? And it's the pandemic has made us question, where are we drawing those lines? And as a civil liberties organization, we have to be very thoughtful about that, both in terms of public health, but also trying to protect those long-term civil liberties. So, things like the masking mandates, that took us some internal discussion. We are supportive of them, but there's also things that we say like they should be, because masking can also be detrimental in terms of how those mandates are implemented, especially for communities of color, where you will see them disproportionately enforced against people of color who are not wearing masks. Or you also see people of color who are then stopped or questioned because they are wearing a mask, even though there's a mandate. And so one of the things we have to take into account is, how are these laws going to be enforced? What are the impacts on communities that might not be, those honestly were not the first things I thought of when I was hearing about masking mandates. I was thinking about public health, but then it was one of those things we had to step back and say, how are other people going to experience this? And, there are concerns. We get a lot of folks writing to us and telling us about what we should be doing on many, many topics all the time, because I found that the ACLU is kind of like a Rorschach, where everyone else sees something differently and like what our mission is, what we should be doing. And we have gotten some stuff around the pandemic and masks and other things like that. But I do think it's especially hard to balance that with the needs for public health guidance. And, I think there are, especially if you're talking about the government surveillance state, there's a lot of places where there are some very concerning trends coming out of this pandemic, how people are using data, how people are being tracked, and also the use of private companies to do that and then influence government decision-making. Because right now, most of our data is not coming from some government big brother. It's coming from all those keystrokes we make and all those apps we log into, and all of that is then fed back into places where the government can then buy the data because they're having someone else collect it for you because you've given up.
My son does a health check in a smartphone app every morning that gets sent to his school that they're using to track COVID at the school. And no one at the school ever sent me like I didn't have to sign off on it. I was never sent privacy policies. I have no idea if it's subject to, was it SOPA? I think that's what it's called. The school.
Yes.
Yeah. SOPA. And to be perfectly honest, I have not found the time to,
read all those user agreements, because no one ever does.
No one ever does, right? And it's just, it's mind-boggling, the data that we are releasing between.
Well, on a plus side, I will say, in terms of that, Vermont did make a big first step this year in terms of stopping the use of some of that data. And you're speaking about Minority Report. In the policing reforms that came out at the end of this very extended session, Vermont became the first state in the nation to ban the use of law enforcement facial surveillance software. So this is something we're starting to see in police departments across the country, where they're using facial recognition technology to scan crowds for people or to scan footage and then make positive IDs. And this is really problematic because we know that it disproportionately misidentifies people of color, women, and especially people of indigenous descent. And so there's stories about people who are getting picked up and arrested for doing absolutely nothing just because a computer algorithm told them this is the person you're looking for. So it's something that I think Vermont made a really smart step as we're proliferating the amount of data that's being collected, the amount of places that the government can be more and more invasive without, through the private market, without their own actions, stopping law enforcement from using that type of, invasive and inaccurate technology. I just want to give a quick shout out to all the legislators here in Vermont who did take an important step on that.
Thank you, Falko, for bringing that up. We are just about out of time. I mean, this show just flew by. I'm amazed. And I feel like we've only touched the top of the iceberg. So I'm hoping we can have you or someone from the ACLU back again in the future. Falko, if people want to find out more about the ACLU, or if they have a question about their civil liberties, where do they go?
Go to acluvt.org, or you can find us on Facebook as well as Instagram. You'll get to see our posts and updates. And when you're there, sign up for our email list, and you get emails from folks like me letting me know how you can get involved, and then also how you can bug people like Emily when it comes to important issues in front of the legislature.
Thank you. Falko Schilling, Advocacy Director for ACLU Vermont. And Emily, where can we find you?
I really like it when people bug me. And the best way to find me is at emilykornheiser.org, where you can find a link to my Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, email, phone number, weekly community conversation coffee hour via Zoom at 10 a.m. every Saturday. Links for all of those things, as well as past episodes of the Happy Hour, are all there at emilykornheiser.org.
And as always, you can find the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station, every Friday at 2 p.m. You can also find us on BCTV, Emily's YouTube channel, and our Vermontitude SoundCloud Facebook page. Have a great weekend, everyone. Before we go, Emily, do you have a toast so we can send everyone off in style?
I have an empty glass, so sorry, I need 1 second here.
No toasting with an empty glass, no.
No. So the balance between community and freedom, and each of us fighting every day to make each of those things better and stronger.
Thank you. Here, everyone. Have a great weekend.
Cheers.